Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, there's a reason why Andrew Yang, that political candidate before who proposed UBI, didn't win the election and fell to last place. It's because it sounds good, bro, but in execution and in reality is far from it when economists and people took a hard look at it and realized supply and demand and how a lot of this money, even if you find the source, ultimately is not sustainable, leads to the shit show of inflation, people becoming dependent on the state, and just wrecking the lives of the very vulnerable people, the ones you claim to champion. Before I move on to my extension, a couple of direct responses against the previous speaker. Firstly, they talked about how 4Ps does not work because of things like nepotism. Very simple response. We can increase the layers of government bureaucracy to be able to crack down on nepotism, like what Cami mentioned to you, things like the Anti-Fixer and Anti-Red Tape Act, which already exist in status quo, to be able to unravel these levers of corruption and nepotism. Yes, it's not perfect, but ultimately this allows us a chance to be able to allow these things to happen. In fact, we think our counterfactual is intuitive. Things like the 4Ps and other kinds of different social welfare programs we have in status quo are things that we want to support. The second thing here is all of the attacks that side government accuses us of are on failures of implementation of social welfare and not on social welfare in and of itself. The question I have, if you can't do a small scale targeted social welfare development program correctly, then how can that very state you claim to be corrupt or that very state you claim to be able to be inefficient do this in a blanket wide policy? All of the harms that they accuse our side of become heightened on their side, and on our side, taking the worst case that these things are inefficient, I'd rather have smaller ones which are inefficient so that we can deal with it at worst, as opposed to this whole blanket-wide systemic policy that if fails, everybody gets wrecked given the material Camille gave you that went unresponded to. The second thing here is talking about this desire to get an education and be able to uplift yourself out of poverty. The flip I have to their argument is the point in which you get money from the state is a point in which you don't become incentivized to get a job anymore. So if you want these people to really get a job and get an education, there needs to be this pressure for them to be able to do it. That is to say, conditional forms of grants and scholarships and aid through stipend that you actually have in status quo as opposed to guaranteed stimulus checks. The intuition pump here is very simple. During the pandemic, they gave 2 rounds of stimulus checks, and look what happened. Everyone lost their fucking minds and chose to do things like chill, buy random stuff on Amazon, short crappy stocks on the stock market, or go YOLO, NFTs, and cryptocurrency. On the average, ladies and gentlemen, people make poor decisions in terms of their finances, and the point in which you fund this campaign is the point in which the harms Camille told you about people becoming reliant on the state and not having any internal incentive structure to get their shit together. What is my extension? I am going to drill down the harms of UBI and classify them on a macro and micro level and how it ultimately harms individuals. And I'm going to weigh that against the comparative, which are social welfare programs and status quo, which we think are targeted, specific. It might be to some extent not the best kind of thing, but at least we're able to marginally get some solvency in terms of being able to help particular people. Firstly, how exactly does this harm individuals? It harms individuals because this creates a toxic sense of dependency on the state. The point in which you get a regular $1,000 check or 50,000 peso package every month in the guise of altruism because you need help from the state is a point in which you literally get a free cash flow line, which if you live below a certain level, you literally don't have to work. The harm there is you don't have any form of productivity, which unlocks the harms Camille talked to you about, which is inflation. Inflation, ladies and gentlemen, is the increase in prices over time, and the simple thought experiment is something I thought about when I was young. When I was young, I wished money grew on trees. I was like, why can't rich people or the government give everyone money so we can buy stuff? The simple reason why that's bad, even though it sounds good, is because people are gonna increase prices. So the point in which that society all gets these stimulus checks and gets UBI is a point in which in the medium to long run prices go up, and this becomes an incentive for the state to have to not do anything or at worst increase UBI. So you see how it becomes a vicious cycle to the bottom. Inflation goes up, they have to increase UBI. If they don't increase UBI, people get pissed off and be like, hey state, F you, it's not enough, I can't buy the burger I like anymore. But the point in which the state succumbs to that pressure and increases that is a point in which it becomes this increasing game, which ironically decreases the amount of money they have because money is scarce for obvious reasons. And that leads to people like the central bank having to print more money and as a consequence plummet societies into inflation, like what we see with the likes of El Salvador and other certain countries in Latin America and South Africa and in other parts of the Middle East. Government side at best is motivated by helping people. On their side, you create a perverse incentive structure wherein pinapaasa mo sila, you think that you're helping them. These people, even if they're motivated to get their life together, won't be as productive or won't work as much because they already get a certain cash flow. They are comfortable in the short term, but this leads to all of the harms that I talked about in my pre-oration, such as people not getting a chance to education, people not having an incentive structure to improve themselves because they're already comfortable. And as a consequence, this ultimately harms these people, but more importantly, harms the upper echelons of society and middle class who are funding these things through taxes, and ultimately leads to the state wrecking themselves. It's like that meme where they're riding a bike and you put the stick between the spokes. The spokes are society and the stick is UBI. Sounds good, but ultimately won't work. We are very proud to take this debate from opening opposition.